Keir Starmer stared straight at the royal guard and mocked. "What is it you protect these days, pigeons or tourists?" He thought he was being witty. What he didn't realize was that he was speaking to a Coldstream guard with for combat deployment, someone who had faced real danger and never once broken protocol. But when the guard finally responded, his words brought the entire forecourt to a standstill. And in that moment, the Prime Minister was exposed in a way no one saw coming. Want to see how it all unfolded? Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The November fog rolled across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace like a living thing, thick and gray in the early morning light. Through this curtain of mist emerged the unmistakable silhouette of power-sleek government vehicles, gliding to a halt with the whispered authority of state machinery. November 15, 2024, marked another routine day in the carefully choreographed dance of British politics, where every gesture was calculated and every word measured for maximum impact. Standing sentinel beside the palace gates was Corporal Ross Kellen, a man whose very presence seemed to embody the timeless nature of duty itself. For precisely 47 minutes, he had maintained his vigil not from any sense of tedium, but from the ingrained habit of a soldier who understood that vigilance was measured in heartbeats and breaths. The battlefields of Afghanistan had taught him that survival often depended on counting seconds, on maintaining awareness even when nothing seemed to be happening. At 28, Kellen carried himself with the bearing of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. The crimson tunic and towering burskin of his ceremonial uniform concealed a man whose chest bore the ribbons of valor, whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen combat in 3 separate deployments. His record with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers spoke of courage under fire, of leadership in impossible circumstances, of the kind of quiet heroism that never made headlines but kept other soldiers alive. The morning air carried the familiar scent of approaching theater. Politicians moved through the world surrounded by their own weather systems, the electromagnetic field of cameras, the gravitational pull of microphones, the atmospheric pressure of carefully managed expectations. Kellen had observed this phenomenon countless times, watching as elected officials transformed the solemn duty of guarding the crown into backdrop for their own performances. As the Prime Minister's door swung open and Keir Starmer emerged into the gray morning, the machine of political theater began its well-rehearsed operation. The smile came first, practiced, measured, calibrated for maximum photogenic impact, then the wave, the casual gesture that suggested accessibility while maintaining the proper distance of authority. Finally, the purposeful stride toward the guards, each step choreographed to suggest both confidence and approachability. The approaching entourage moved with the fluid precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. Media handlers positioned themselves at optimal angles, their movements guided by years of experience in capturing the perfect shot. The Prime Minister's personal staff clustered at respectful distances, their expressions carefully neutral, their eyes constantly scanning for potential disruptions to the planned sequence of events. Starmer's briefing materials had included extensive notes on the guard he was approaching, Ross Kellen's service record, his decorations, even his hometown in Wales, all filed away in the political mind that approached every encounter as an opportunity for strategic advantage. The plan was elegantly simple: engage with the guard, demonstrate connection with military personnel, generate positive coverage that would reinforce the government's support for the armed forces. Yet something in the absolute stillness of the figure before him seemed to disrupt the Prime Minister's carefully prepared approach. Kellen stood with the kind of immobility that spoke of profound discipline, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the assembled crowd. He was not merely standing guard. He was embodying the very concept of steadfastness, transformed into a living monument to duty and sacrifice. Perhaps it was this very quality, the guard's complete absorption in his role, that prompted the Prime Minister to reach for levity. Politicians, by nature, are uncomfortable with silence, trained to fill every pause with words that might bridge the gap between themselves and their audience. The impulse to humanize the moment, to transform ceremony into conversation, seemed almost irresistible. "Tell me, Corporal." Starmer's voice carried the practiced warmth of countless public appearances. "What exactly are you guarding against out here?" "Pigeons." The question hung in the morning air like a challenge, its casual tone belying the fundamental misunderstanding it revealed. Here was a man who had never stood watch in a hostile environment, who had never felt the weight of responsibility for others' lives, attempting to reduce the ancient tradition of military vigilance to a punchline. The assembled journalists tensed with the predatory instincts of their profession. This was precisely the kind of moment they lived for, the unscripted exchange that might reveal something genuine beneath the polished surface of political performance. Their fingers hovered over recording devices, their eyes sharpened with the anticipation of capturing something real in a world of carefully managed artifice. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire, growing more significant with each passing second. Ross Kellen's response, or rather, his complete lack of response, transformed the moment. From casual interaction into something approaching confrontation, his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his posture unchanged, his breathing so controlled as to be almost imperceptible. In that profound stillness, the power dynamics of the encounter began to shift in ways that no one had anticipated. The Prime Minister, accustomed to immediate responses to his words, found himself facing something unprecedented, a human being who seemed completely unmoved by the presence of political authority. The guard's silence was not passive, it was active, purposeful, a demonstration of priorities that placed duty above deference to temporary power. Starmer's smile began to show stress fractures around the edges. The confident politician, who had approached the guard with such assurance, was discovering that his usual tools of engagement, charm, humor, the implicit authority of his office were having no effect whatsoever. The cameras continued their relentless documentation, but now they were capturing something unplanned and potentially dangerous. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gathered aides, the kind of forced laughter that emerges when people sense that something is going wrong but aren't sure how to fix it. The sound seemed to emphasize rather than relieve the tension, highlighting the growing awkwardness of the Prime Minister's position. "Oh, come on." Starmer tried again, his voice carrying a note of forced joviality that couldn't quite mask his growing discomfort. "Surely you can break protocol for the PM?" It was then that something shifted in Ross Kellen's demeanor. His eyes moved just barely, just for an instant, taking in the Prime Minister's face with the kind of assessment that only comes from years of reading potential threats. In that fleeting glance, the guard seemed to be measuring not just the man before him, but everything he represented. The casual dismissal of military tradition, the assumption that protocol was merely performance, the fundamental disconnect between political rhetoric and lived reality. The brief eye contact lasted no more than a second, but it was enough to convey something that words could not. This was not a man who would be moved by political pressure, who would compromise his principles for the sake of someone else's photo opportunity. When his gaze returned to the horizon, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full of judgment. The tension in the air became almost palpable as the Prime Minister's frustration began to show. Years of political success had accustomed him to a world where his words carried weight, where his presence commanded attention, where even his casual remarks were treated as significant. The guard's continued silence was not just professional discipline. It was becoming a form of resistance that undermined the very foundations of the political theater. He was trying to perform. Starmer's next words came in a lowered voice, perhaps intended for his inner circle, but clearly audible to the microphones that surrounded him. "Christ, it's like talking to a brick wall." The comment hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Here was the unguarded moment that separated the private man from the public persona. The instant when careful political calculation gave way to genuine irritation. The journalists froze, their professional instincts warring with their recognition that they had just witnessed something that could reshape the entire narrative of the encounter. Ross Kellen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first visible sign that the Prime Minister's words had found their mark. The insult, for that's what it was, seemed to strike at something deeper than professional pride. Here was a man who had served his country in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable, who had risked his life to protect the very freedoms that allowed politicians to make casual jokes, being dismissed as an inanimate object by someone who had never faced enemy fire. The transformation that followed was subtle but unmistakable. The professional soldier's mask remained in place, but behind it, something human and dignified was stirring. When Kellen finally spoke, his voice cut through the morning air with the precision of a blade honed by years of command responsibility. "With respect, Prime Minister, I am a wall, one that doesn't crumble when pensioners lose their heating allowances." The words landed with devastating accuracy. This was not merely a guard speaking out of turn, this was a direct challenge to government policy, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that could only come from absolute moral conviction. The reference to heating allowances was not accidental. It was a surgical strike at the heart of the administration's most controversial decisions. The immediate aftermath of Kellen's words was a moment of perfect stillness, as if the entire world had paused to absorb the implications of what had just occurred. The Prime Minister's face cycled through a series of rapid expressions: surprise, confusion, and then the dawning realization that he had just been publicly challenged by someone he had attempted to humiliate. The reference to heating allowances carried particular weight because it touched on one of the government's most politically sensitive decisions. Just 3 weeks earlier, the administration had announced cuts to winter fuel payments for pensioners, a policy that had sparked widespread protests and criticism. The decision had been defended as necessary fiscal responsibility, but for many, it represented the kind of cold calculation that prioritized budgetary concerns over human welfare. Starmer's political instincts engaged immediately, his mind racing through possible responses that might allow him to regain control of the narrative. "I assume you're referring to the welfare reforms. Those were necessary fiscal." But Kellen cut through the political doublespeak with the same precision he had used to deliver his initial challenge. "My mate Carl sleeps in a car park. Sir lost his legs and helmet. Your necessary reforms just cut his disability check by 30%. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a sound like distant thunder building toward a storm. A reporter's phone appeared, its camera capturing not just the words, but the electric tension that had suddenly filled the space between the two men. The Prime Minister's aide stepped forward, perhaps sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond their ability to control it. But Ross Kellen was not finished. His final words carried the weight of personal experience, of friendship tested by hardship, of promises broken by the very system that was supposed to protect those who had served. "You asked what I guard against. Indifference, sir. The kind that lets men like Carl rot while politicians make pigeon jokes." The challenge was complete, devastating in its simplicity and impossible to dismiss. The guard had not just defended his own dignity, he had spoken for every veteran who had ever felt abandoned by the system they had sworn to protect. Every service member who had discovered that political promises were as fragile as morning mist. The story of Carl McKinnon was one that exemplified the gap between political rhetoric and lived reality. At 24, he had been a promising young soldier with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, known for his quick wit and unshakable loyalty to his mates. The improvised explosive device that detonated beneath his patrol vehicle outside Kandahar had changed everything in the space of a heartbeat, transforming a healthy young man into someone who would struggle with the basic tasks of daily life for the rest of his days. The blast had taken both legs below the knee and left Carl with a traumatic brain injury that turned simple conversations into exhausting mental exercises. The promised support systems had proven woefully inadequate to deal with the complex needs of someone whose injuries were both physical and psychological. Months of rehabilitation had taught him to walk again on prosthetic legs that never quite felt like part of his body, while the brain injury made concentration a constant battle. For a time, Carl had managed to build something resembling a normal life. He had found work as a security guard, had rented a small flat in Cardiff, had even begun a tentative relationship with a nurse he had met during his recovery. But the cost of living continued to rise while his disability payments remained static, creating a mathematical impossibility that no amount of personal determination could overcome. The latest round of welfare reforms had been the final blow. The letter announcing the reduction in his monthly benefits had arrived with the bureaucratic coldness that characterized all government correspondence: dry, impersonal, offering no recognition of the human cost of the decision it contained. The reduction was significant enough to make the difference between survival and homelessness, between dignity and desperation. Carl's attempts to appeal the decision had led him into a labyrinth of bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed more to discourage than to help. Forms that required information he couldn't provide, appointments that were scheduled and then canceled without explanation, phone calls that ended with him being transferred from one department to another until he gave up in frustration. Ross Kellen had found his friend sleeping in his car behind a supermarket in Cardiff, 3 weeks after the eviction notice had been served. The proud soldier who had once patrolled some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan was now homeless in the country he had served, invisible to the politicians who had once praised his sacrifice in carefully crafted speeches. The immediate chaos that followed Kellen's challenge was barely contained by the protocols that governed such encounters. The Prime Minister's media team huddled in urgent consultation, their carefully planned schedule suddenly thrown into complete disarray. This was the kind of uncontrolled moment that political handlers spent their careers trying to prevent. Authentic, unpredictable, and potentially devastating to carefully constructed public images. The journalists present sensed the significance of what they had just witnessed. This was not a routine photo opportunity or a carefully staged interaction designed to generate positive coverage. This was genuine conflict, real emotion, actual stakes. Within minutes, the first clips were being uploaded to social media platforms, their poor video quality more than compensated for by the clarity of the audio that captured both the Prime Minister's dismissive comment and the Guards' devastating response. The hashtag Guardians of Truth began trending almost immediately, accompanied by hundreds of comments from veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who saw in the Guards' words a voice for their own frustrations with government policy. The story was taking on a life of its own, spreading through the digital ecosystem with the kind of viral intensity that only comes from moments of genuine human drama. Back at Downing Street, emergency meetings were being convened with the kind of urgency usually reserved for international crises. The Prime Minister's press secretary was fielding calls from journalists, demanding immediate responses, while the communications team worked frantically to develop strategies for containing a story that seemed to be growing larger by the hour. The government's initial response was predictably cautious, focusing on the procedural aspects of the incident rather than engaging with the substantive issues the Guard had raised. A carefully worded statement spoke of respecting all perspectives and valuing the service of our military personnel, but the generic language could not disguise the fact that the Prime Minister had been publicly embarrassed by someone he had attempted to humiliate. The palace hierarchy faced its own crisis management challenge. A royal guard breaking protocol to challenge a prime minister was unprecedented in modern times, requiring emergency consultations about disciplinary procedures and appropriate responses. But there was a significant complication. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supporting the guards' actions. The story evolved rapidly as professional news crews arrived at the palace, equipped with high-definition cameras that could capture every nuance of expression and gesture. By mid-afternoon, footage of the exchange was playing on every major news network, with slow-motion replays that emphasized the dramatic tension of the moment. Political commentators were already analyzing the implications, while historians drew parallels to other instances when protocol had been breached in service of higher principles. The real power of the story, however, came from its resonance with ordinary people who had felt similarly dismissed by the political establishment. The comments sections of news websites filled with stories from veterans who had struggled with bureaucratic indifference, from families who had watched their loved ones fall through the cracks of government systems, from citizens who had felt unheard by politicians who seemed more interested in photo opportunities than genuine engagement. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into the issues that Kellen had raised, uncovering a pattern of systemic problems that extended far beyond individual cases. The story of Carl McKinnon became a window into broader failures of the welfare system, revealing bureaucratic delays, inadequate support services, and policies that seemed designed more to reduce costs than to help people. The government's attempts at damage control only seemed to amplify the story's impact. When a junior minister suggested that the Guard had been inappropriate in his comments, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Military veterans flooded social media with their own stories, creating a narrative that painted the administration as fundamentally out of touch with the realities faced by those who had served their country. Ross Kellen himself maintained his characteristic silence, adhering to military protocol even as the storm swirled around him. His refusal to capitalize on his moment of fame, to give interviews or make public statements, seemed to enhance rather than diminish his moral authority. He had said what needed to be said, had spoken for those who could not speak for themselves, and now he was returning to his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had made him an effective soldier. The movement that formed around the Guard's challenge transcended traditional political boundaries. Veterans organizations found their voices strengthened. Military families began sharing their stories more openly, and the public conversation about social welfare shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. The confrontation had become a catalyst for broader discussions about the treatment of those who had served their country. The political reverberations of the incident continued to expand as opposition parties seized on the moment to highlight what they characterized As the government's callous approach to social welfare, parliamentary questions were tabled demanding explanations for the cuts to disability benefits, while committee hearings were scheduled to examine the broader impact of welfare reforms on military families. The Prime Minister's approval ratings, which had been climbing steadily since the election, began to decline as the story maintained its grip on public attention. The carefully constructed image of a leader who understood and valued military service was being undermined by the visual evidence of his dismissive treatment of a decorated veteran. The contrast between his public statements about supporting the troops and his private reaction to being challenged by one was too stark to ignore. The palace's response to the situation was characteristically diplomatic, but subtly supportive of its guard. While emphasizing the importance of protocol and proper procedures, the official statement also noted the proud tradition of service represented by the guards and their deep commitment to the values they protect. The careful language managed to acknowledge the violation of protocol while recognizing the principles that had motivated it. Carl McKinnon's story, meanwhile, was receiving unprecedented attention from both media and government officials. The publicity surrounding his case led to emergency intervention from veterans' charities, while the government fast-tracked his benefit appeal. In what critics characterized as damage control rather than genuine policy reform, his individual situation improved dramatically, but the arbitrary nature of a system that required media attention to function properly was thrown into sharp relief. The broader implications of the confrontation extended beyond immediate political considerations. The incident had crystallized public frustration with a system that seemed to prioritize bureaucratic efficiency over human dignity, that treated those who had served their country as statistics rather than individuals deserving of respect and support. In the weeks that followed, the long-term impact of the confrontation began to manifest in concrete policy changes. The government announced a comprehensive review of disability benefits, though critics argued that the timing suggested political calculation rather than genuine concern for affected individuals. The speed with which the review was initiated stood in stark contrast to the years of advocacy that had preceded it, highlighting the power of a single moment of authentic confrontation to achieve what systematic campaigning had failed to accomplish. The cultural impact of the incident proved even more significant than its immediate political consequences. The phrase "I am a wall" entered the common vocabulary as a symbol of principled resistance to institutional indifference. The image of a solitary guard standing his ground against the most powerful politician in the country became a powerful metaphor for individual courage in the face of systemic failure. Ross Kellen returned to his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire career. Though his status among military personnel had been transformed, colleagues spoke of his continued dedication to duty, his refusal to exploit his newfound fame, and his quiet satisfaction that his words had sparked meaningful conversations about issues that had long been ignored by the political establishment. The guard's silence in the aftermath of the incident was as powerful as his words had been. He had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective form of political action was not sustained activism, but a single moment of authentic response to injustice. His return to duty after delivering his challenge emphasized that his motivation had been principle rather than personal advancement. The confrontation had revealed something fundamental about the nature of leadership and accountability in democratic societies. It had shown that sometimes the most important truths are spoken, not by those in positions of official authority, but by those who understand the difference between power and responsibility, between rhetoric and reality. In the end, the encounter between a prime minister and a royal guard had become something larger than either man had anticipated. It had become a moment of reckoning about values, about the relationship between those who govern and those who serve, about the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional indifference. The guard had stood his ground, literally and figuratively, and in doing so had reminded everyone watching that some forms of authority are earned rather than appointed, that some voices carry weight not because of their position but because of their truth. The final image that remained in the public consciousness was of Ross Kellen back at his post, motionless and vigilant, his eyes fixed on the horizon with the same unwavering focus that had defined his military service. He had returned to his duty, but something fundamental had changed. The silence was no longer passive. It had become active, purposeful, filled with the weight of words spoken and truths revealed. In that silence, accountability had found its voice, and the guardians of truth had proven that walls, when they speak, can shake the very foundations of power itself.